All right, we're going to begin. Carl Gottlieb will begin, and then we'll see where we go from there. And at the end, if I don't pass out, we'll have a little Q&A.
Thank you all. Welcome to this particular event, a series of events in a series of fabulous venues that none of us had the time to actually enjoy during the months that we were here making the picture, where we shuttled between sleep, food, and the set, and the incomparable and seemingly inconquerable moments that strung together actually wound up making the film. It's a great pleasure for us to be back on the Vineyard. This is my second visit in 30 years, and the other visit was a brief one where I stood on a few sets or locations and said to the Travel Channel, yes, this was the courthouse. See this courthouse? This was the courthouse. See this office? This was an office. This beach? It was a beach. The film was a triumph that was never foreseen, except that in the business, every film is a hit until it's released. And only a few of them become a hit after they're released. And we were very lucky that that happened for Jaws. Universal has decided now for the 30th anniversary to release a 30th anniversary DVD reissue, which I'm very proud to be holding up in my hand here and sitting in front of the posters. It contains a 2-hour documentary which has never been seen before on DVD. It represents a great deal of work by the kind of people who delight in finding the arcane and lost materials that are the legacy of every major motion picture. I worked from a script that was developed from another script that was developed from another script that was developed from a novel. And if it wasn't for that novel, none of us would be here. And the gentleman to my left, always a gentleman, wrote that novel. I'm very pleased to be sitting in his left hand and introducing him to you. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Peter Benchley.
Thank you. If I were Soviet, I would do this to thank you for the applause, because this, after all, you were what made the picture the success that it was. I don't know, some of you may have heard this already, but when I wrote the novel, David Brown, who with his partner Richard Zanuck is one of the most gracious men in the business, and I had never been in the movie business at all before. I had no experience with it, whatever. And David came to me and he said, only because of your vast knowledge of sharks can you alone write this screenplay. And the fact that I'd never written a movie before in my entire life didn't occur to me. It occurred to me only that David was obviously very perceptive in knowing that my knowledge of sharks was what was going to make this movie a success. So what I didn't realize was that there was an up-and-coming Writers Guild strike threatened, and that because I'd never written a movie before, I wasn't a member of the Guild, and I could at least write one draft that they could then cast off of. It could be garbage, but it at least was a structured draft based on the book somewhat. So I took instructions from Richard Zanuck: get rid of the love scenes, get rid of this romance, the adultery, the organized crime, the dead cat. Forget all this stuff. This is an A to Z adventure story. Shark bites person, person chases shark, shark eats more people, people kill shark, end of story. So what I did was basically transliterate the novel into a screenplay that was, I think, to be kind to it, it was dead. It sort of lay flat on the page because it had no movie business in it. I didn't know how to write movie business. And when I finally saw what Carl and Stephen and the actors had wrought, I began to realize that this enormity of difference between a novel and a movie. I'll give you just one example. The little bits of business that you see Roy Scheider do with the children at the table, just playing back and forth, making gestures to one another, and this kind of thing, which really I couldn't write. I don't know whether Carl wrote it or whether it was all ad-libbed on the set, but that's movie business that I wouldn't have known the vaguest thing about how to write. I would write a strong narrative with a good, long, strong story, and that would carry it. But all the richness of detail had to come elsewhere. And when finally, after several attempts by other hands, it came to Carl to work with Stephen during the entire shoot, that's when I venture to say it came together and became a movie. One of the contests over the years that people have always asked me about and I had no answer for was, how did I write that wonderful speech for Robert Shaw about the Indianapolis? And was it hard, and did Shaw give me a lot of trouble with it? And my answer is I not only didn't write it, I didn't know it existed until I saw the movie. And I thought Carl had written it, and the only real truth that I've ever seen is in Carl's wonderful book, in which he says that Shaw wrote the whole thing himself. And there are many writers who take credit for that particular speech, which is one of the highlights of the film. But I wish I had written it. That's one of the many things in the movie I wish I had written. David Brown, with the collusion of Spielberg, chose to cast me in the movie because I was getting a lot of publicity for the picture doing ABC television shows about Jaws and about sharks and about the making of the picture. And so I played a television reporter, which was what I was doing for a living then anyway. It wasn't exactly a stretch. But that little bit on the beach took days to do. They had a dolly track here going this way and that way. Wendy and our two children were in the scene. There are things you would never see there. The producers were standing and screaming on the jetty, stop this madness. People were threatening suicide. It was a long and horrible experience, but I was only party to one little bit of it. I'll tell you the one story that I do recall having done. I was told to interview Robert Shaw for ABC, and I did. I was told to catch him earlier in the day rather than later, and for whatever reason, I was unable to catch him early in the day, and we got him in the early afternoon, and we sat in the Orca, and Robert looked at me and back and forth and started to tell a story about his wife and a donkey she had owned at one time. And then he finally stopped and he looked at me and he said, "Did you write this book?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Piece of crap." So that was my first experience with Robert Shaw, which made me want to leave right away. But my experience with this in the filming was really as nothing compared to Carl's, and so I will turn over for a few minutes for Carl's to tell you his rather more close experience than mine.
Talking about the scar comparing scene in the boat, in which the Indianapolis speech is a major part, but it's a part of a larger scene. I've decided as we were sitting here that the good thing to do would be at each one of these events reveal something that's not in the book or that I haven't revealed, or something that I'm reminded of just as a result of participating in the weekend. And Peter reminds me of an untold Indianapolis speech story, again related to Shaw's love of the grain, the alcohol. He was a drinker. Let's be frank. Robert liked his drink, and the scene was scheduled to be filmed over 2 days in order to get the coverage of all the actors and the interior of the boat and wide shots and masters and 2 shots and close-ups. And the Indianapolis speech, Robert's big close-up, was the first day, and there was real whiskey in his cup.
Really?
And he drank. And it got later in the day and later in the day, and he began to go off script. Now, these are the words he wrote himself, and he was off book and wandering and improvising wildly and talking about Naco Nolans and kind of getting Craig Kingsbury stories mixed up in his own life and combining his life and Craig Kingsbury's. And finally, we said, cut. That was the end of that. And Robert, abashed because he knew he wasn't completely present as an actor for much of the scene, said to Stephen, look, I can do it better, Stephen. I can do it better. And Stephen said, I hope so, because, we're coming back. We're doing it again tomorrow. And we're doing it without alcohol, Robert. No alcohol. Robert said, okay, you're right, Governor. So the next day they shot the scene dry. Just an actor, classically trained, working at the top of his form. And Verna Fields, who won an Academy Award for editing, has cut together takes from day 1, drunk, to day 2, sober, and they're in the same scene, and you can't tell the difference except for this one thing, which I've never shared before today. If you look very closely at Robert's close-ups, the ones where his eyes are watery is day 1. And where his eyes are clear is day 2. But the cutting back and forth is superb, and the scene, as it turns out, plays beautifully, and it's a tribute to all the writers who worked on it, including Robert Shaw, who did the real donkey work and lifted it up and made it his own. And whenever everybody talks about having written that scene or any part of it, I remind everybody, who do you believe? The guy who wasn't there and tells you he wrote it, or the guy who was there and tells you he didn't? So, and the production was, full of, Robert Shaw had a bullet fired through his door by some disgruntled islander. There was a real town and gown conflict here. And there was half the island didn't want us here, and Bob Carroll and everybody who sold stuff did want us here, because they sold a lot of stuff. And we had a great time. And looking around here, I'm reminded of folks who I haven't seen for a great many years. Edith Blake, who took a lot of pictures and put out a competing book, over which I was furious. How dare they put out another book about the making of Jaws? And then there was a third guy who came out with a book about the making of Jaws. And then I realized if the film can sustain that much additional activity, hooray for all of us, and may we all do well and prosper. Although I at the time I was muttering to myself and checking the bestseller list to see if is Edith Blake on there. Okay, no, am I on there? Yeah, okay. And some of these stories turn up on the DVD and the special material, and everyone has their own memories, which is the most astonishing thing. I was convinced until a month ago that Roy Scheider had ad-libbed, "We're going to get a bigger boat." Then I pick up Vineyard magazine and I read a contemporary interview done within the last 2 months with Roy Scheider, who says, "Oh no, that was in the script. I didn't ad-lib that. I did some other ad-libs, but that was in the script." Now I've got to revise my whole life experience and start claiming credit for that line, because I've always been able to say, no, I didn't write that, ad-lib that. And I remind everybody that when an actor has a character that's been carefully crafted for that actor, and if the writer has done his or her job in writing a complete character, when it comes time for the actor to ad-lib, or if the actor feels suddenly inspired to add a line of dialogue, if the actor is doing his or her job in fully inhabiting the character, they will ad-lib in character. And who created that character? The writer. So, in the beginning was the word, as they say, and actors don't make up the dialogue as they go along. It's all carefully written down. They memorize it and they say it. And the genius of actors is they give you the illusion that it's for the first time. When they say a line, it's as if they just thought of it. And that's the art and the genius that actors bring to film and to the stage. So we're all much in debt to them. But writers are the artists of original creation, and directors and cameramen and composers and actors are the artists of interpretation. And it's a slightly different business. And I'm an artist in this particular film of adaptation, and Peter was the artist of original creation. Now, since Jaws, I worked on Jaws 2 and Jaws 3D. I had nothing to do with Jaws 4. I want that very clear. And I remind you of the iron law of sequels. Only the last one loses money. That's why you've got Police Academy 12. Only the last sequel loses money. So when they got to 4, they lost money, they stopped. But 2 and 3 were written under similar circumstances. They started without a script. Well, they had a script, but they didn't like it, and then realized they didn't like it after they started shooting and prepping the picture. So in both cases, I got a call at the last minute, because I'm sure people said to themselves, well, let's get somebody who can come to location, drop everything he's doing, work on a film that he hasn't seen the script for, and perhaps he'll make it coherent where it hasn't been yet. And then, luckily enough, I was able to do that with director Jeannot Swark, and on 3D with director Joe Alves, who was with us all the way and was responsible for so much of the design and visual elements and second unit direction on the first 2. So and a lot of those folks are here today, which is fabulous. And you go on and you have a career. I wrote another hit movie that became something of an icon, The Jerk with Steve Martin. Thank you. And as I slide into being a senior Writers Guild vice president and attending to writers' issues and getting less and less involved in the making of motion pictures, I'm resigned to being a Jeopardy category. Hits that begin with a J. Who was Carl Gottlieb? Larry Gelbart, the writer who created the television series MASH, among other wonderful, wonderful plays and films. Larry Gelbart said he knew it was time for him to think about retirement. He said, I just went to a network meeting on a new project and there were fetuses in suits talking to me. So we only can hope that the generation of fetuses in suits who are running the business will rediscover some of what it is that we do, because they have rediscovered what people have done because they only make comics, old movies, remakes of movies, and adaptations of best-selling novels. The notion that an original script might get to the screen as a big tentpole picture, not as an independent feature or as a small picture. The idea of a big picture getting to the screen without some identifiable roots is, for the time being, a dream. But that's the depressing side of it. The exciting side of it is that the business keeps making movies. They keep showing them worldwide. It's part of the popular culture as never before. The new technology, the DVDs that include so much material that was never available to people who enjoyed films. Unless you were an insider, you never got to see outtakes and hear the additional comments of the directors or actors or writers of the film. Now you can study a film the way you can study a great book because of all the commentaries that are attached to it, and that makes life interesting. Peter, of course, went a different way, and I'm going to ask him now to talk about the fish and all the fishes like it, who have taken a very bum rap. And Peter's spent a good part of the last 20 years making up for popular misconceptions and misinterpretations of his original work. So, Peter.
I reject the atonement notion. But talking about when it was time to retire from the film business, I have had several reasons to retire. Once was the first time I heard, "Didn't you used to be Peter Benchley?" And then finally that goes into, "Didn't you used to be somebody?" The answer to which is always no. No, I really didn't. I went on and wrote a bunch more novels. There was one also with Robert Shaw that was a modest hit called The Deep, with and he was equally wonderful in that, and not really handicapped in any major way. He did a truly wonderful job. And I was basically invulnerable. I had 2 hits in a row. I couldn't possibly fail, which is this myth in the movie business. If you have 1 hit, you're a fluke. If you have 2 hits, you're amazing, and you're the person to hang everybody's hat on. I had 2 hits, and I was golden. And so I had a 3rd movie made, and it was a flop. And I couldn't get my phone calls returned anymore. All of a sudden, literally overnight, there was one weekend the movie opened, and by Monday I wasn't getting my phone calls returned. Suddenly you realize that the great experience I'd had on Jaws and on The Deep really was more fantasy than reality. But the great thing that Jaws gave me, aside from putting my children through college, school, everything else, was freedom, and the freedom to go off and learn about what I'd written about. And ABC came to me between the book and the movie and said, "Hey, you've written all this about great white sharks. Would you like to go swim with them?" And I paused a little bit and I said, "Well, sure, I guess so." And if I could take with me one of the people who was in Blue Water, White Death, which is the great documentary about sharks that some of you may have seen. So I had a neighbor named Stan Waterman who was one of the cameramen on that film. And he and I and Wendy went to South Australia, and we filmed great white sharks and got in the cage with them for the first time I'd ever done it. And very few people had by that time. And because nothing can go wrong, something went wrong, and the shark got wrapped up in the rope keeping the cage to the boat, took the cage under the boat and was beating it to pieces. And everybody on the boat taking pictures of this was saying, "Yo, man, far out, down that, whoa, look there, far out." And got the cameras down there. And only Wendy, who had been banished to the fly bridge because she was a woman in Australia where women were always banished, she saw what was going on, and she jumped down and she grabbed the rope, and the shark at this time was coming up the rope, and she grabbed the rope and started calling the shark names, and the cameramen are still going far out, and the shark is grunting and spitting blood from the chum in the water, and his eyes are rolled back. It looks like a maniac. And she finally shook the rope free, and it was no big thing for everybody but me and her. But this was my first experience with great white sharks in the water. And I went on because ABC's American Sportsman wanted people in certain fields to go do things in other fields. They wanted a baseball player to go be a fly fisherman, or a movie actor to go be a mountain climber. And in this case, they wanted anybody to go swim with sharks, and nobody would do it except the lowest of the low, a writer. So they got the writer, and they kept asking me to go do these shows, which turned out to be the greatest thing for Wendy and me ever, because we got to go all over the world and dive with all of these wonderful animals and to learn about the plight of the oceans. As more and more, 30 years ago, there were a great many sharks in the ocean. I don't know if some of you have seen the statistics. Some of you who live here would certainly know them, that in the Atlantic, for every single shark, for every 30 sharks that lived 30 years ago, let me take this whole sentence from the top. There are less than 10% of the sharks alive today that there were 30 years ago. They've been reduced, the populations of sharks and other large fish have been reduced by 90% in the last 30 years. 90%. So all the blue sharks we used to see around here in Nantucket, where I grew up, they're not there anymore. The makos, the whites, the basking sharks in the summertime, they're not there. populations of billfish, tuna are all declining. And so as we became more aware of this, the shows that I was doing and the books that I was writing became more and more attuned to the environment and to trying to press the message home that the oceans are not as invulnerable as we thought they were, and we really have to do something about this. So that's what I've been doing for the past 30 years, really is turning my life around into becoming more of a marine conservationist and writing. I wrote a couple of comedies in the meantime, and then I wrote a thing that became a mini-series called Beast about a giant squid. Then I ran out of big ocean creatures. So, but basically for the past 10 years, I've been concentrating on marine conservation. And I have here about 12 or 15 minutes of film that I wanted to show you from a show that I did for the Geographic a few years ago, in which basically the message is how little we still know about great white sharks, how much there is to learn. And aside from the practical point of view of not wiping out animals worldwide, the amount aesthetically and academically and intellectually we have to learn from and about these animals is staggering. So I'm going to just set this up for you. We went searching for great white sharks on the 25th anniversary of JAWS, sort of, a little later then. And we went to at the time, the three places they were to be known: South Africa, where we were just, as you'll see, we were just discovering remarkable behavior never before seen; South Australia, where they had been seen; and the coast of California, which had no luck there. So what you're going to see here is we've been to South Africa. We've had very little luck with white sharks. We know that they're in decline. And now we've gone to South Africa, where we've heard that white sharks do an unprecedented thing. This is a 3,000-pound animal that apparently breaches. In predation, it shoots off the bottom and like a rocket ship comes up and breaches out of the water. A whole body out of the water, which nobody believed. So with David Dubélé, the National Geographic photographer, myself, Rodney Fox, who was a white shark attack survivor, and can't think of the others, a couple of scientists, we went to South Africa and looking for this breaching behavior and one other thing. And so if you'll run this film, it starts just as David is getting his first first shots of the shark breaching. And it goes on for about 12 minutes and I'll stop it. I know. And said, how do you buy universal stock? And that was the first indication of, again, popularity. But then Verna Fields, her genius was just really remarkable. Stephen asked me to sit and look at every frame of shark footage to make sure it looked realistic. But then, the affirmation comes, as Carl said, when the people who make sausage really appreciate it. Anyone else? Yes, sir. No, the question was this anything that I did based on the shark attacks in Manasquam Inlet in the creek in New Jersey? And it was not. No, I did not. It had nothing to do with that, although people like to think that it did. So I had heard about them, but that was all. Anything else? Oh, yes.
In the short time we've seen you, you guys are so gracious. And you reflect that on the time as writers. The book was great, the movie was great, but they were very different. How did you feel, Peter, in second question is, your personal reflection each on what 25-year-old Steven Spielberg is like.
I can answer the first better than the second because Carl worked with Steven for months, and the press loved making a fight out of the Stevens and my relationship. And every time we spoke to or about one another, the press had it that I was calling him a moron and he was calling my book a piece of garbage and this, that, and the other. And none of it was true. We got along very nicely. Stephen at one point said that he didn't like the ending of the book. A perfectly fair comment because the ending of the book would make a lousy movie. And that came back to me as Spielberg says your book is a piece of excrement, which he had never said. So I responded like a jerk, and we had this kind of thing, but I worked very well with him. I didn't work very long with him, because I turned in the 2 or 3 drafts of the script that I did, and it was very clear to Stephen that he was going to have to go to a professional screenwriter. And at that point I realized right away that books and movies are different critters altogether.
Yeah, and then Howard Sackler, who I never met, we were serial collaborators. Howard Sackler, who had written Great White Hope and was a yachtsman and a sailor, knew about the Indianapolis, figured out that was a good motivation for Quint, found created a monologue that existed in his script and all the subsequent scripts. And then I inherited a script that was a completed script that had been budgeted and boarded and scheduled. And then we just, with the recklessness of youth, Stephen and I just took it apart 10 days before we started shooting and made this other movie that had a lot of similarities to the script, but was different. And we had just the chutzpah of youth. There's a production meeting that takes place just before the start of every film, every television show. It usually occurs about 2 or 3 days before principal photography. All the key department heads, props, scripts, electric, camera, special effects, all meet, and they read through the script. You go through the script scene by scene, reaffirming everything that's going to be, we'll need this effect here, or the shark is going to have to do this here. And we had just rewritten the movie, and all I had was 3 pages scotch taped together of the outline of the film. And Stephen and I sat in front of Bill Gilmore and Joe and all these way experienced hands who had done hundreds of films to our 3. And we said, okay, the lighthouse, we're not going to be there. You don't have to dress the inside of the lighthouse. We're going to be more days in the house. We're going to be a couple more days in the interior of the boat. Over here, we're not going to do this. Over here on the beach. And we weren't quite sure what it was we were going to do, but we went through the script and said, these are the changes that we envisioned. And God bless the pros who said, okay, and accommodated the changes even as they were occurring, even as they advised against us doing some things, but they showed us ways to do it, other ways that saved time and money and kept the spirit of the film. So it was an adventure, huge adventure.
I don't remember hearing of any great acrimony at all, but was there between individuals?
Well, there was cabin fever. I luckily got out at the end of the dialogue sequences. After 2 months, when my partner as an actor was finished, after all the cover scenes had been photographed, when they had nothing left to do but shoot the ocean, I got to go home. They stayed for 2.5 more months, going out to get 30 seconds, 10 seconds, 6 seconds of usable film a day, and sometimes days with no footage. And there was a food fight, there was some shouting, there was some bad feeling. But it's the enmity of the foxhole and the frat house. I mean, you wind up fighting a larger enemy, which is the completion of the film. And when you've done that, then all is forgiven. So it worked out okay.
Yes. That's true, yes. For every human being killed, or roughly 10, the 100 million sharks are being killed mostly by the finning industry. So it's a losing battle, and there's very great fear that some species of sharks will be extinguished, commercially if not actually. So that in the past, 20 years, 10 years, the technology has completely outstripped the resource. They can now kill, some of the long lines that are being used are 80 miles long. And they have hooks every 100 feet or so. So you're killing thousands and thousands of animals indiscriminately. It is a problem that has nothing whatsoever to do with JAWS. It has to do with technology and the rapaciousness of our breed. Yes? No, he and about 6 other guys were the inspiration, as all characters, especially colorful characters. They're composites of other people. And I went out with many fishing captains in my youth, of all of whom had pieces of Quint in them. I met a guy in California who swears to me that he was Quint, and that I went fishing with him in 1968. Absolute fiction. The entire thing was a fiction. I never went fishing with him. I never met the man, but he's Quint, so no, certainly not. He was part of it.
Yeah, Frank Mundus wrote a book called Sport Fishing for Shark, which was one of the books that I consulted when we were putting the movie together, yeah.
He was a big, colorful shark fisherman at that time, and he benefited hugely from the publicity that he generated for himself. And I think that
his genius was as much in self-promotion as it was catching fish.
Right over there's a lady who's had her hand up. Carl says he has one story that will tip us right off in an hour, and I think that's a perfect way to end.
It's a story more about the film industry than it is about JAWS, but years and years ago, Sam Goldwyn, the legendary producer who helped found Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, was kind of accosted by a critic named Stanley Kaufman, who wrote about film for The Nation. And Kaufman said to Goldwyn, he said, "Look, Mr. Goldwyn, you should be ashamed of yourself." And Goldwyn said, "For what?" And Kaufman said, "For making such trash in such quantity. Here you have film, a global institution that is capable of changing lives, changing how people feel about themselves and about the institutions and the politics, and all you do is churn out populist crap, one film after another." And Goldwyn said, wait a minute. He says, "Grant me that once a year we make a good picture." Kaufman says, once a year, twice a year, this was back in the 50s, Hollywood makes 500 feature films a year, and you could have the opportunity, you've got the greatest talents and writers and photographers. And Goldwyn held up his hand and said, wait a minute. Answer me this. Even by your standards, Mr. Kaufman, by your standards, grant me that once a year, Hollywood makes a good picture. So Kaufman says, all right, I'll grant you. Once a year, Hollywood makes a good picture. And Goldwyn says, remember, he says, we don't have to. Yeah, Verna Fields was cutting the movie in a cutting room in her garage in her backyard of a small house in Van Nuys, California, deep in the San Fernando Valley. It's a little house, little cutting room, and she liked to work at home. And the film was in its final stages of completion, and the head popping out of the bottom of the boat. The shot that Craig Kingsbury said, I don't understand how a shark eats somebody and spits the head back into the boat. But nonetheless, that was the moment, that was the beat that Stephen wanted. That's what we wrote, that's what he shot. And he wasn't happy with the way it was in the film at that point. The film was finished. The studio was, we were cutting the film, going to lock the negative. Stephen said, I really want to make that shot again. And the studio said, no. We're not going to put together a crew and go to the tank on the back lot. So Stephen said, I'll pay for it myself. And I don't believe he actually did, but he said he would. And a kind of a little guerrilla conspiracy, which was possible in the days of big studio operations where the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. They went to the back lot, they put the boat on a truck and then took the head. No, Joe was there. Joe built the boat. Joe reconstructed the set, because that's right, because we couldn't get it off the lot. Teamsters wouldn't bring it. What? Yeah, I know. And he reminds us of Stephen. Well, Stephen was cheap. Stephen was a poor tipper. Joe built the boat in his backyard. Yes, that's right. Bill Gilmore, who's here now, wouldn't have allowed it had he known that we were doing it. And they got Rex Metz as a favor, because he was the underwater photographer who had gotten a lot of work shooting for the studio. They said, "Come on, Rex, we got you so much work, you'll do this one shot." So I went out to Werner's swimming pool, which is a small pool, not like a swimming pool. It was a little pool. It was like an 18-foot kidney-shaped little 50s swimming pool. Put the boat into it, tarped it over with visqueen and plastic so it was dark and you could shoot. The water wasn't quite the right consistency, so they went out and got a half gallon of milk and poured it in the pool to give it that cloudy consistency that would photograph well. Snuck the head out of the studio, brought it down, put it in the boat, boats in the water, heads in the water. Rex Metz is in the water. He got a head, our head, and to quote dialogue, and they made the shot. And after a couple of takes, it was the shot that Stephen wanted. And that's the shot that went into the movie, and that's the shot that's the biggest physical move the audience makes in 2 hours. And Stephen and I and my ex-wife, who was then my wife Allison, when we were out for dinner on a Thursday night in midsummer, we knew what time the head would pop. And we took it out, watched it on the evening, the 8 o'clock show, the head came at 9:02. So we finished dinner, go down to the theater where the manager knew us, because we did this more than once. We'd go into the back of the theater and just stand there, and the moment would come, the head would pop, and we'd watch 1,200 people in the orchestra of the theater on Hollywood Boulevard. We'd watch 1,200 people go, whoo! They would just levitate and come down. And then we'd high-five each other and go out.
There is an exceedingly urgent question back there, and then we'll stop.
Peter, if you ever written a sequel to JAWS, your novel, would you still accept an annotated with...
Somebody's going to have to relay the question to me. I didn't hear it.
If you were to have written a sequel to JAWS, what kind of story would you have done? Where would you have set it for the story?
I was asked to do it, and I submitted a suggestion of a sequel that turned out to be about the ancestor of JAWS, which scientists at that time conceived might still be alive, called Megalodon, Carcharodon Megalodon, about the mother of all sharks. And it was a terrible idea, and Universal turned it down. All right, thank you very much for coming.